The first, of course, is because anything that undermines Ukraine and undermines Ukraine's connection with the United States is a win for Russia. So to be able to make the point that the United States allegedly abandons its allies or will leave those that it's supported in a lurch out to dry is certainly something that can undermine the Ukrainian democratic project as well as U.S.-Ukraine relations. I also think there is a self-interested motivation in this comparison, and that is to draw attention away from the fact that Russia had a very similar experience in Afghanistan, of course, at the end of the Soviet period, and that war was lost and ended in defeat for Russia. And you don't hear Russia talking about that very much either. So I think it's twofold there. But the main purpose is, of course, to undermine that U.S.-Ukraine relationship. And the comparisons don't really make sense. If you look at the length of the military engagement, the amount of lives lost, the amount of money spent, there's really no comparison. And additionally, the purpose of the war, the reason that the United States got involved in it to begin with, is very different than what is going on in Ukraine, which is the undermining of Ukrainian sovereignty, the seizure of Crimea, the war in the Donbass, all instigated by Russia, which the United States is trying to help its democratic ally withstand. Very, very different situation than in Afghanistan, which was harboring terrorists. And then we can have an argument about why the United States continued to be involved after so long. But I don't believe there's really any comparison to be made there. Always in favor of reaching people in the language that they speak on a daily basis in their homes. I think a good example of how this can work is Canada or Switzerland, where there's many multilingual people, multilingual kind of governments that work well together. And I think Ukraine can certainly be an example of a multilingual environment like that as well. Estonia is another example where, although you have to learn Estonian language for citizenship, the government has recently started investing in Russian language media in order to reach the Russian-speaking population. I think that's really important, not only to combat disinformation, but to make sure that the population who might otherwise be disadvantaged or disenfranchised is getting communication from the government, that they feel like they're being heard from the government. And I think the idea that the Zelensky administration has been investing in more Russian language communications with people in Ukraine's east is a good investment. And I'd like to see it ramped up even further to kind of fill the vacuum that has been created by the sanctions on some pro-Russian, Russian-speaking, Medvedchuk-owned TV channels and other media outlets over the past several years. There's a couple of narratives that Russia uses in order to weaken the U.S.-Ukraine relationship. And I think it's important to underline that they are all based somewhat in grievances that exist or a reality on the ground that exists, either in that U.S.-Ukraine relationship or in Ukraine itself. So we see this narrative of Ukraine being a corrupt country coming up over and over again, not only in Russian language media, but in U.S. media as well. We saw this in the lead up to the 2020 election here in the United States with allegations of corruption by Hunter Biden related to Burisma. And we know those came from Russia. Of course, Ukraine has a corruption problem. That's one of President Zelensky's main hopes for his administration, to fight against corruption. And so by using that kernel of truth, that real corruption problem, and amplifying it and blowing it out of proportion, Russia intends to undermine U.S. confidence in Ukraine, as well as Ukrainians' own confidence in their own government, which is unfortunate. And it's a very potent narrative. We also see some narratives about the West and Western political institutions being tired of Ukraine, having Ukraine fatigue, which certainly I think is visible sometimes when the EU is re-upping its sanctions, when the US Congress is debating how much money to give Ukraine for purchasing weapons or for supporting Ukrainian democracy. These are always matters of debate. And I think Russia likes to use those as an indication to the Ukrainian public that the West and that the United States doesn't support Ukraine as much as we might otherwise. And that's unfortunate, of course. We also see narratives about the far right spreading in the United States, the far right in Ukraine. So certain far right political movements that are distasteful to Americans, that have very little political clout in Ukraine, are blown out of proportion to seem like they might be these proto-fascist, proto-neo-Nazi movements in Ukraine. And yes, there are far-right figures in Ukraine. There are individuals that the State Department has declared unsavory groups, to say the least, and put them on far-right watch lists. But the amount of influence that they have over Ukrainian politics is negligible. Russia would like Americans and those in American policymaking to think that they're more overblown than they actually are. And in reality, I think the folks making the policy at the White House, at the State Department, recognize that vulnerability, but understand that it doesn't represent all of Ukraine, just like corruption doesn't represent all of Ukraine. In fact, we know Ukraine is a vibrant and democratic society that is pushing to reform. And that's the Ukraine that, people who actually have experience in the country know and love, and certainly the narrative that we try to push back at with Russia. We, unfortunately, in the United States, I think, have underestimated the relevance of disinformation and the potency of disinformation. I think we look at it as something that happens on the internet and not something that affects people's real lives. But as we've seen in Ukraine, and as we've seen in the U.S. Capitol on January 6th, and recently, we just had another bomb threat at the U.S. Capitol because of someone who listened to disinformation narratives. Disinformation affects us in real life, too, whether it's about people who aren't taking the COVID vaccine or people who are causing these public safety threats at public buildings, or beyond, people who are deciding now to take medicine meant for livestock and animals instead of the COVID vaccine. And I think, in terms of our response, we have absolutely not done enough on any level. We've not seen enough recognition from consecutive administrations, both the Trump administration, certainly, which used disinformation, and the Biden administration, which is trying to clean up after what the Trump administration did, but also get some of its own programs going to fight COVID, to end the war in Afghanistan. They're overwhelmed, and I think in some ways not seeing the connections between disinformation and the many crises. President Biden likes to call them cascading crises that we see right now. So when we have migration at the border and we see some people in the United States saying, "Oh, it's migrants from Central America and South America who are bringing COVID and the Delta variant to the United States." Obviously, that's false, but it's connected to disinformation, as are our problems with people who are anti-vaccination, as are many of the problems we're dealing with in foreign policy from Afghanistan to Ukraine right now. And so I would love to see a more robust strategy come from the Biden administration that not only encompasses foreign policy, it not only encompasses social media regulation, but it also looks at the very human elements of disinformation. What makes disinformation appeal to people? What makes people engage with it online? What makes them change from just reading that disinformation to actually acting upon it, whether it's taking medicine meant for animals instead of the COVID vaccine, showing up to a protest, that sort of thing. And right now, we have parts of the US government that are dealing with that. We have parts of civil society and the media that are dealing with it, but we don't have a unified strategy or a unified understanding of how it works. And what's worse, many of our own politicians, particularly on the fringes of the political spectrum, are using disinformation. So we're not in a very good state right now. I wouldn't say we're worse necessarily than it was at the beginning of the year when the insurrection at the Capitol happened on January 6th. but it's not good. And I don't feel like we've made very much progress. It's nice to have an administration that tells the truth, that you can trust what they're saying. But we need to start taking a more active role, not only in the United States in terms of regulation and programming to help people who have bought into disinformation, but also abroad. There's a role for the United States to counter disinformation around the world that I fear that we've not really stepped into yet.